Hello everybody, and welcome to our latest Kids Matter webinar, Help Me Seek Help, Make It Safe. So particularly welcome to those who are new, and welcome back to those of you who've been before. So it's great to have so many of you joining us today to talk about Help Me Seek Help and thinking about how we can make that safe. So what is Kids Matter? It's a framework to guide services, schools and schemes to grow healthy minds at their place. And there's professional learning and a wealth of resources to support you to do that. So just to let you know too about Kids Matter is that we are funded by the Australian Government, the Department of Health, and our partners are Beyond Blue, Principles Australia and the Australian Psychological Society. For those of you who know how to use the Kids Matter space, we really encourage you to engage in the chat and share your stories and ask questions and learn together with each other in the chat. If you're new, the chat function is on the left-hand side of your screen, and you can type in the box down the bottom. If you don't want to have the chat, you can minimise that and just concentrate on listening and hearing the speakers as well. So if you need any help, there's technical support that will help you too. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting you from the land of the Kaurna people here in South Australia in Adelaide. I'd like to pay respects to Kaurna elders past, present, and think about elders into the future, because they hold the culture and dreams of Aboriginal and Aboriginal people in our region. You might like to pay respect to the elders and the country that you're meeting on today, and you can write that in the chat. One of the things at Kids Matter that we really value and try to bring to the work that we do is that we can learn a lot from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing, doing and being. And this is part of a commitment to reconciliation. And integral to that is that listening is fundamental. Listening not just with our ears, but with the whole of our being. And so I want to acknowledge that we can learn a lot from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about how to listen like that, and how to listen with the whole of our being, and truly notice and be respectful of the things that we hear and experience. And I'd like you to keep that in mind as you're thinking about going forward into this in this session, particularly if we're thinking about the idea of making safe. One of the things we also value and regard very highly at Kids Matter is the notion that we need to make and create and maintain a safe space for everybody. So you'll see on the screen our Kids Matter posters and also our Kids Matter, one of our Kids Matter symbols, which really demonstrate and illustrate and reinforce this idea of making safe. So there's a couple of things I want you to really think about today. This webinar is talking about help seeking, but integral to that, and part of that is making sure that we're all safe in that space. And safety is not just about physical safety, it's actually more about emotional and social safety, so really keeping that in mind. So as we have our conversations today, think about your own safety and self-care, think about privacy and think about confidentiality. But also think about that as you listen and hear Kerry and Lynn talk about the aspects that we're going to learn about help seeking, and think about how that might look for children that you work with, but also families and also with each other. So I'd like to, we're going to set the scene a little bit. I'd like to introduce Kerry, who's part of the Kids Matter team, and Lynn, who from the APS. They'll be talking with you today about various aspects. So we're going to look at help seeking in terms of understanding what help seeking is. We're going to think about and explore some of the challenges, and we're also then going to move into how we can invite help seeking and how we can respond to help seeking when we see it from children and from their families. So, Kerry, do you want to just say hi? And Lynn, do you want to just say hi quickly?
Hi, everyone. Welcome aboard.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So thanks, Sarah.
So we will hear more from Kerry and Lynn in a moment, and they're going to pick up on each of those aspects of help seeking as we go through. So remember, if you've got any questions or thoughts as they pop up, just pop them in the chat, and Kerry and Lynn will be and we'll be able to answer them. But you might be able to answer them from each other as well. So the other thing to keep in mind is that Kids Matter is part of has a professional learning focus, and today we're going to really focus on 2 Kids Matter topics. So if you're a Kids Matter participating service, these are really important things to keep in mind, that you're going to be focusing on a topic around communication and also a topic around responding to children who are experiencing mental health difficulties. If you're, as I said, if you're a participating Kids Matter service, that will make sense to you. And when you talk to your consultant or when you check in a networking event, make sure that you have conversations with the people that you're chatting with about the topic, the webinar, and how the topic might have played out in your service as well. If you're not a participating Kids Matter service and you'd like to find out how to connect in with that, there'll be more information about that towards the end of the session. So we're going to start off with a poll, and we're going to have a look at some statistics. Now, if you haven't done a poll before, what we'll do is we'll get Kathy to pop the poll up, and it's a multiple choice, so you can choose more than one, but have a think about which of these statistics surprise you the most. And we're going to talk about where we got some of these statistics from some recent research that's come out from the Royal Children's Hospital a bit later on. So we've got 1 in 7 young people experiencing mental health condition in any year. Parents aren't sure that they need to get help. Oh, looks like we might have that twice. There were some parents who reported from that survey that they thought the problem would go away or get better by itself. Some people feel that help's not affordable. And remember, you're responding to any of those that surprise you. Looks like we might have them double up though, so you don't have to click twice, just choose one. All right, so maybe we'll stop the poll now. I guess one of the things that's interesting about statistics is that it's how people understand and interpret what's going on for them and how they share that with other people. Lynn and Kerry, did you want to add anything to?
I think we'll pick up on some of those things as we're going through. So any of them that you're sort of surprised about, we'll talk to them, I think, as we go through tonight.
And talk
Kerry?
about them in the context of some of the barriers, I think, too, and maybe how educators can address some of those barriers. So it's always useful, I think, to perhaps use some of that research in understanding where parents are coming from.
Yeah. All right. Well, so let's go launch straight into thinking about how we understand what help seeking is and what it might look like, because I think that's really important for people to think about in their context and to set the context. So we'll hear from Lynn and she'll give us some input about that.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about early childhood mental health that we're kind of always thinking about children within the context of the environments around them. So family and the early childhood setting, wherever it is that you're working, and the broader community and extended family and other people in their lives. So part of when we're thinking about help seeking is thinking about recognising mental health difficulties. And so one of those statements was very much about parents not knowing that there was a need, so not recognising the need for that. So to do that, we really need to be thinking about early childhood services recognising their role in helping parents to get that information. So I think that survey result can really help us to see that the importance of this role, that parents don't always know what to look out for, parents don't always have the language. So there's that mental health literacy as well as the signs that we might be able to help them to understand. And that often starts with really the promotion of positive mental health first, and then when signs of concern show up, helping parents to know that the service is a place that they can talk to. And that's very much a focus of tonight. I think in terms of health-seeking behaviours for children, it's a really good place to think about the child first. And so Sarah touched on listening and sort of being able to tune into another person with our whole self, so noticing. So a child can be showing us that they need help through their behaviours. So older children we might expect, and adults we might expect that they can tell us and express their needs and tell us that they need help or there's a problem. But younger children, and particularly babies and children that don't have language yet, are really needing us to be tuned in and cued by their behaviour. So they're not going to always be asking directly for help. So there can be signs that they're showing us, and you would see that on a day-to-day basis, and this is something you'd be doing all the time. So noticing, observing when the behaviours happen, why they're happening, is all part of that help-seeking process, even though we might not see it as help-seeking. So recognising that as early as possible, helping children and giving them the language over time as well, checking in with them, asking, making sure that they're hearing the language, and then responding so that they can see that when they do reach out that they're getting their needs met, and that's a really important part of the help-seeking process, but also their development and their developing mental health is a really important part of that. So this might, of course, mean working together at the service and also having some discussions with family members around that. So that does bring us to parents and carers, and they might ask directly for help. So some of them might do that, but as we've just seen, they might not recognise the need for help, or they might not know how to ask for help. So their behaviours might also suggest that they need some help. So if they're rushing in the morning and having difficulty separating from the child, looking quite stressed, it might mean that there's a place there. Just as we're seeing behaviours in children, we can see behaviours in adults as well, and we might recognise that that's an opportunity for us to offer have some help and to have a conversation that can enable that sort of help seeking to happen. So it might be that extended family members are also part of that, and you might find yourself in a situation where grandparents or other people are approaching early childhood service and asking for help. And this is where we then get into that zone of confidentiality and privacy and thinking about, well, we want people to be reaching out and asking for help, but we need to think about how we manage that and what are our processes and policies around that, because it can be a really tricky situation. So when we're talking about how do we manage different conversations with different people, and how can we do that, and is it that we sort of directing them back to the parents or getting them to perhaps have the conversation with parents about their concerns, but that's something that we really need to think about. But these are all the kind of elements, I guess, of help seeking that you might come up against, and some of them, as I've said, will be really obvious, and some of them might be less obvious, that you have to tease out a little bit and help people to feel like they can ask you some questions, or they can actually ask for help if they do need it. I'll move on to you now, Kerry, I think, to pick up on a bit more about the challenges and the difficulties.
Thanks, Lynn. I think it's probably good to start by just reminding ourselves that, educators play a really crucial role in this area in terms of identifying and reducing the impact around barriers and challenges to help seeking. I think we're in a really privileged position here as educators and can make a huge difference, I think, with parents and children. So, we know many of these barriers can discourage families from discussing, topics that might be sensitive and perhaps raising their own concerns. But we know that when we can communicate with families on a regular basis and we work collaboratively with them and we respect their input and we've got some good communication happening with those families, then we can make a big difference. And I think just even understanding or taking the time to understand some of those barriers that prevent parents and perhaps families from seeking help, if we take the time to do that, we're more able to connect with that parent. We can often reduce a lot of defensiveness perhaps around, them opening up and their fears in many cases. And we can really start to assist them to start looking at the needs of their child and exploring possible ways to move forward. So until we have that, that parent and that family's trust, it's often very difficult to do that. And I think being able to tune in to both to, how we're feeling and also perhaps the parents' needs and how parents are feeling, that's really important because that will help to establish some really positive relationships, and that sort of trust and cooperation and mutual problem solving can start to happen. So we mentioned a few barriers Sarah put up in the poll, and I think it might be really good to just unpack a couple of those now. There's been some recent Australian research that would suggest, some of the key barriers in early childhood settings and with young children in school settings tend to cluster around maybe 3 or 4 key areas. And some of those are around recognising mental health difficulties, or what we'd say is mental health literacy, basically what we know or what families know about mental health. A second area is around accessing support services and perhaps the difficulties like costs with accessing support services. And then there's also barriers around stigma or perhaps issues that parents either perceived or real that they feel, may impact on them in a negative way, and so they may be reluctant to seek help. And I think from a lot of the stories, when I talk to educators, there's also concerns around perhaps not having a connection or trust with parents, and that may be a barrier too. And that could be for all sorts of reasons. Maybe a parent's new, you haven't had time to build that relationship, etc. So I think, taking a little time to understand some of those. In that slide, we've put some of the findings up around that recent research, and I think some of that is quite surprising, particularly around perhaps parental confidence and not always recognising the signs of a mental health problem or not feeling confident in doing that. So that's a third of Australian parents, which is quite a substantial group, I think. A third of parents don't recognise that persistent sadness and frequent tearfulness and crying is not normal in children. Nearly a third report being so busy it's hard to connect with their children. So that actually is quite a surprising statistic too, I think, and maybe that's just a reflection on how busy, some of our lives are these days. But some of the positives are that, more than half of parents are saying that what may help them most is having information around day-to-day signs of both physical and social and emotional and behavioural problems in children, and perhaps some of those indicators or those ways that they can help to understand and recognise, some of those behaviours that we're talking about in young children. And that is certainly within the scope of our role as educators to provide that. And, many of you are doing that on a very, very regular basis. We also know that, supporting parents in their role as parents is a very strong protective factor for children's mental health. So being able to provide that information does make a huge difference. It may be worthwhile just focusing also on that group of children who perhaps come in with an established diagnosis to a centre or a service. And if we don't know that parent very well, taking some time to look at the relationship and establish that relationship can be very important. So we might have a really matter-of-fact approach in that kind of situation where perhaps, a child is coming in to a service with a diagnosis. We might want to find out information. And so we might say something like, well, look, tell us about your child. What are their strengths? We really want to focus on, how that child manages day to day, what things are working really well at home. Are there any challenges perhaps that educators want to know about? Have they got any mental health difficulties perhaps that we need to talk about or that we need to be aware of? And that approach can really assist families to, focus on some of those strengths and help families feel understood and cared for. I think a lot of educators that I talk to in Kids Matter services often talk about parents not being ready to respond, to perhaps information around their child's behaviour, or they're just not ready perhaps to hear about some of those difficulties, and that may be because of fears about perhaps what that means for that child or family, or it might be that there's just a little disconnect in terms of the timing. A lot of directors and services, say to me, look, we already know that child perhaps is going to need additional support within the first month of entering our service, but a parent may not be quite ready to receive that support at that time, and it may take 6 months or perhaps even longer, for that trust to be built and for them to want to start seeking out support. I think we can do a lot by being in tune with parents' feelings and really holding that safe space for parents to talk about what's concerning them. And sometimes that might mean putting our own feelings aside and respecting, parents' wishes not to really pursue intervention at that time. So that's a lot around, recognising signs, I guess, in that mental health literacy aspect. Some of the other barriers around accessibility to support or services often focus a lot on things like costs, lack of information, perhaps about where to get help, not knowing where to go, maybe not being able to navigate the health and community systems or not being familiar with those. Sometimes waiting lists are an issue. And it can also be that parents may have actually experienced, negative things around seeking support in the past, perhaps in their own, in their own life. So that can be a difficulty as well. I think with stigma, that's sort of that third area of, research that indicates, where there's some parental concerns, perhaps, being able to be in tune with parents' feelings around shame or perhaps denial, fears about a child being excluded or treated differently because of social isolation, or maybe where parents have they have a feeling that perhaps the choices will be limited for their child. And some services say to me, look, particularly where children might be transitioning from kindergarten or into prep or prep into year one, that there may be issues around that child receiving a diagnosis because they may be afraid, the parent may be afraid that child is not going to get into the school of their choice. So sometimes taking the time to really maybe just connect with some of those fears can be really helpful in allaying those fears over the longer term. And from the child's perspective, it might be, as Lynn mentioned, more around, how do we as educators really tune into some of those behaviours and those strong emotions that perhaps children, might be displaying. They're not necessarily going to ask for help directly, but we need to be tuned into what's happening around some of those behaviours and emotions and to help children to regulate in that area. So I guess the key message here around some of these barriers is, focus very strongly on supportive communication and relationship building, perhaps as one of the first steps, and take that time to really try and understand, where families are coming from and how we might influence that in a positive way. Okay.
Thanks, Kerry.
I might hand over Sarah at this point.
Yeah. So we've kind of set the scene a little bit, and so we're going to take a little bit of time now to do another poll. And what we really want to shift, I guess what we've done is Lynn's talked to us a little bit about the, how we might understand help-seeking behaviour in children and in families, and Kerry's talked around some of the barriers and those things linked together. And before we move into what you can do to invite help-seeking and support help-seeking, we really want to think about what your what you might already be doing to support help seeking in your place. So we'll pop the poll up now. And while we're doing that, we had a question from Crystal, and maybe Kerry, I'll get you to respond to this one first, and then perhaps Lynn. So Crystal's asking us, when is separation anxiety a major problem? When do we classify that as a major problem?
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, and we know that anxiety in young children around separation is very normal and very common in a lot of families that are first starting in services where they may not have had that experience. But I guess it becomes a major problem when there's significant changes, either in the, maybe the frequency of that child's behaviour, perhaps in the intensity of it, whether that may have escalated perhaps over a short period of time, or where the parents are really reporting, concerns around not being able to manage that, and where they're starting to feel stressed. Lynn, would you like to add?
Yeah, I guess I would say that it would be a problem if parents are really distressed as well. So I'd be probably thinking about, I guess, picking up on what Kerry said about why now, and is it something new? Is it at the start of the time at the childcare service, so it's part of that transition, or is something happened and trying to make sense of it? But I think if parents are distressed and then that's distressing the child, I think that then becomes a bigger problem. So sort of catching it as early as possible to try and prevent that, but also for parents to have a chance to talk about it and make sense of it, to see what's going on is really important. And we know for all of this that the earlier we do that, the better, that it's easier to catch things much earlier, and early intervention is really important. So not to sort of normalise it too much, even though it's often quite normal and developmentally appropriate, but not to sort of let it go on for too long and then find that it's become a bigger problem that we wish we'd caught it a bit earlier.
Yeah, and Lynn, maybe when educators start to become concerned, when perhaps some of those strategies that work for most children, they're finding, that behaviour is continuing over time, and they're starting to become concerned. That might be the time when perhaps you start to look at what support options might be available.
Yep.
Yeah, and Crystal's actually responded, but we might just stop the poll and just make a quick comment on most people are saying that they feel like they've got quite effective strategies, more so for families than for children. Some people don't know that they're particularly effective, but most people have some kind of idea that they've got some strategy to support help seeking. So we'll stop the poll. And just before we move on, I'm just wondering if either of you would like to respond to the next part of Crystal's. So she's saying what's happened is that they come at the beginning really excited, but the separation anxiety builds towards the end of the year.
Maybe everyone's getting a bit tired at the end of the year, and there's pressure on people, I guess. And I guess these things, people pick up on each other's energy, whether that's positive energy or not such good energy. So I guess it's worth thinking about what is happening around the place, and what are the sorts of things that are triggering it. But I think it is reasonable that the end of the year is a time when everyone's feeling a bit stretched, and Christmas is however many days away, and that does place pressure on us, and different things that are happening in communities as well.
All right. Kerry, did you want to say anything else?
No, probably just maybe looking for anything that may have changed at home, or perhaps, in early childhood settings too. So if that's an end of year thing, and those children or that child's been travelling along quite nicely, and then there's a sort of a change in that behaviour, that might indicate that something has happened, at home in their routines, or perhaps, that might be worthwhile then doing some observations or checking that out with the parent a little further.
I was thinking, if it's heading into school, and thinking some children might get quite anxious about the fact that, this wonderful place that I've been at for maybe 2 or 3 years is not going to be anymore. And, who knows? But, it is about noticing and listening and watching and talking and gathering information, isn't it? And we might be different too, that self-awareness that you talked about too, Kerry. Or we could get stuck having that conversation for a long time. We need to move on to the next bit. So I'll get Lynn to maybe start talking about how we might work towards inviting help seeking. And again, remember to put your examples in the chat if you've got any or questions. Thanks, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think we can often think about help seeking as something that people should do and adults should know how to do, and that they, it's an individual capacity or it's a responsibility that they have. However, we also know that the environment or the culture of a particular place can play a really critical role in opening the door that enables help seeking. So it's actually, help seeking isn't sort of a dynamic. It's an interaction. It involves people feeling like they know to ask and they can ask, but also that it'll be safe. And particularly when we're still aware of stigma and people not necessarily feeling like that it's safe to ask, or that their concern will be taken seriously. So that can begin with having a shared understanding of mental health difficulties. So services who are very busily doing Kids Matter and have done a lot of conversations and had conversations around what mental health is and trying to work through some of the stigma, and have provided information about what mental health, positive mental health looks like, and then what mental health difficulties might be. So any of the conversations or information or posters that have been used can be really helpful to set that scene. So that's very much part of this planned approach, that help seeking doesn't just happen. It's part of the work of Kids Matter, and the framework is built to enable you to set this culture of the sense of community sort of language, but also a help-seeking community. So recognising that young children can experience mental health difficulties, so that it's actually something that is real, something that it is okay to talk about, and that can be difficult to accept. So in the early stages of services, talking to parents about Kids Matter, and even themselves, workers thinking about children having mental health difficulties, it can be pretty confronting, because we often like to think about childhood as being a happy and carefree time, and that would be nice if it was the case for everybody. But we do know that children do experience difficulties, and that means that we really wanting to provide staff and families with information and the resources about this, so that they're able to act as quickly as possible, as we've been talking about. So that's the starting point, the kind of basis of what mental health means. Positive mental health is important for children. And then if there are signs and symptoms that you can more easily have a conversation with families about, that enables you to share information and to identify that there might be a concern, which we've seen from the survey results from the Royal Children's Hospital. That's really important, because parents don't automatically know that. So all of these conversations you're having means that then parents can start to see that there might be some concerns. So then you've got to be ready to respond to these questions as well. So if you're having these conversations, you can expect that parents might then say that might be my child, or now I'm worried about my child. So having these conversations means that you're then needing to be ready to answer and be prepared for that. So it's really important to, sort of think about, as a service, what do we do and what do we have in place? So things like the Kids Matter Bettles tool that hopefully everybody is aware of and has seen can be really helpful, where you gather information, and it's very specific information about children's behaviours, emotions, thoughts, learning and social skills. So you're pulling all that together with a lot of information about the context in which that happens, along with the strengths and capacities that children have, and that gives you a tool to be able to have a conversation. And then you can start to talk with families about that. So, and if they're coming to you, that's good, because then it's much more of a two-way process as well. So it's much easier to respond, as we've said, when concerns are smaller, and it's having less impact on the child's development if it's caught early, rather than it's going on. So children struggling with difficulties can impact on their capacity to enjoy coming to the service, engage in play, and develop their social connections with children and adults as well. So the earlier we can recognise the signs, help parents with this help-seeking process that we kind of need them to be part of to do anything, the easier it will be to shift children off a pathway where they might be heading towards more serious difficulties, or some need to get some further support. Sometimes if it is a change that's happened or something's going on and we catch it quite early, we can kind of tweak things and work and interact with the child and support the families in a way that can make some real changes quite easily in terms of how children react and respond to what's going on. And in that way, we can be really hopeful in conversations with parents. We can give them a lot of hope and very positive messages about things that we can do. So have that kind of attitude. So the way that staff build a safe and trusting environment for children and parents to seek that help and have these kind of conversations that override any stigma, override any concerns about seeking help and worry about that, can mean that we then get a sense that it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to be uncertain about things, it's okay for these behaviours to be seen as behaviours that are telling us that there's a concern, so that we're not embarrassed by the child's behaviours or feeling threatened by that, but we're actually seeing them as indicators. So tuning into what the child is trying to tell us, that it's a child's way of trying to get some help as well. Sometimes both children and parents might test out whether it's actually a safe environment to seek help. So parents might make a vague comment or ask a question in a way that doesn't really appear to be about a particular concern. They might talk about someone else's child, or they might sort of cover it in a way because they're testing it out. So how the staff member responds will determine whether they can ask again or whether they feel like they can trust the service to share more of their concerns. So being tuned to that is really important, and that is the little day-to-day things that happen that might not seem like they're going to matter that much because we're all busy and we're just kind of getting through the day, but they do send a really strong message to parents. And I did see a comment in the chat about we're busy and it's hard to invest time with parents and to find that time, and that will be the case with all the things that people have to do. But I guess when we are trying to create an environment of help seeking, we can invest the time, and that it can then make it easier. If we do have concerns down the track, it can make it easier to have those conversations. So it's almost like building the trust in the relationship takes some time as an investment that might then save us time later on. But I certainly appreciate what people are saying about the time. But having clear policies and processes that outline how both staff and parents will handle things, so how the service can help families, and being clear about what's the process. Who do you talk to? Do you just talk to the first person, parents talk to the first person they see, or what's the process? And letting parents know about that can help them to feel more confident about that. There might be different ways of making contact. So thinking as a service, what's going to work for us? Do we want people to phone us at a particular time of the day, or phone us to make an appointment first, or are we happy for them just to pop in and have a conversation? Is email a better way to do it? What's going to be work for us, but also what's going to be less confronting than a face-to-face conversation? Sometimes it's easier if people have made an appointment and then come to the face-to-face time. That can be easier for them. So it's kind of balancing our needs as workers with the needs of families as well. And so that sort of combined with consistent visible messages that this is a place where we will support you with your child and your family is a really important part of the whole picture. So providing information in ways that people can understand, and obviously that might mean in some environments parent-friendly language and translated materials and information. So really understanding what are the needs, who is our community, and how do we make information accessible is really important, because we can't expect parents to come to us if we haven't given them enough information to understand what's going on, and the message that we're genuine in our efforts to reach out and to provide support. So this could include making connections with other requirements that you have. So we know in Kids Matter we've got lots of different things that you can be doing, and trying to meet the needs of other requirements that you have through Kids Matter is a way of helping you manage your time and making things fit together. So things like the Strategic Inclusion Plan is a specific plan for people to be inclusion ready. So it might be that that's some work that you're doing, and hopefully you're not seeing that as separate to your Kids Matter work. So it means that that's part of that work that you're doing, and then getting some information and support through that process can help you also to build that in. Having boundaries around the support can be really important as well. So service staff are there with the priority on the child, and part of that means working with children, but also recognising that you're not mental health professionals, you're not there for that role, but you're certainly important in terms of children's mental health. But there will be people in the community, and again, I appreciate in some places that there's more access than in other places. But thinking about who is in our community from a healthy community service point of view that we can work collaboratively with. So thinking about we're part of this community, we've got children and families who are going to need some support. As much as we're trying to do lots of positive things and promote positive mental health, there will be children that need some support, and we need to have clear roles and processes around who we are and what our role is and what we do best, and then recognising that there are people in the community who will be able to support the families, and we can work collaboratively together. So we're we've got the child with the family and the services and the early childhood staff working together. So it could be that doing that work earlier, again, not waiting until you've got a family and then you're trying to find a service when there's potential distress, or parents have reached out and then they're let down because you haven't been able to get some support for them. So looking at who's in our community, talking to local councils, looking at primary health networks and seeing what mapping they might have done of services, talking to the local staff to try and get a picture of who's in our community, and then making contact with some of those key services to find out, well, what are the priorities for them? What are the opportunities? Are there waiting lists? Who are the people that they can see and who don't they see, so that you're not wasting time or wasting parents' time trying to find the right service. And really encouraging parents to reach out and to know how to have those conversations to facilitate that process. The Bettles chart, again, can be really helpful for you to give to parents, so they go with some information to get some service support and assessment happening. A letter can be really helpful if you're able to do that. So it's really encouraging parents to seek help, and you knowing who's there is a really important part of that. So you're facilitating that process, and you're encouraging the help seeking, you're making it as easy as possible, so it's like a warm kind of referral that people can have, and that's also supporting you, so that you're not there alone trying to support the family. So there's lots of things, I think, that services can be doing to really encourage and enable help seeking to happen with really positive outcomes. So I'll stop there and move across to you again, Kerry.
Yeah, Lynn was raising some really good points there, I think, around educators being in an ideal position to connect with families on a regular basis. So I think we as educators have lots of opportunities to practice some of those skills, and we've focused on making connections and communication. And we're going to unpack that a little bit in the next few minutes around particular communication skills that might really help that process around help seeking. But also, we don't work in isolation. We're part of a community and part of a network, and we might need to regularly ask ourselves, how do I interact, and what's the interface between me and the other services in my community, and who can provide that support outside of our four walls. Where do we have those relationships already, and maybe where those gaps are, and perhaps do we need to do some work in terms of establishing maybe some of those referral pathways as part of our planned processes. And I think Kids Matter have some great communication tools as well. So we're going to mention a couple of those, and maybe Sarah might put some of those up in the chat. One that, areas that are particularly useful to go to, I think, when we're talking about help seeking and responding to children with mental health difficulties, are around our component 4 areas, and also some of the communication videos, and our e-learning package in Kids Matter, which is a great self-paced e-learning package that educators can really connect with, I think, and do as a team. So I'd really recommend, following some of that. And we're going to show in a little while a little video snip from that package, just to give you a bit of a taste for that tool as well. So just going back to that idea of, responding, being in tune, and that kind of shared care approach, and maybe picking up a little on that. I think one of our videos in our Component 4 Topic 4 area is really worthwhile having a look at a couple of those areas, because they really do talk about being in tune with parents and some examples. So one video, they talk about, my child's been having nightmares every night for a week, as an example. So you may have a parent who comes to you with a particular difficulty. It may be, we've talked a little around anxious behaviour and anxiety in this webinar, but it could be around other behaviours that are concerning the parent. And perhaps our role as educators then is to connect and say what's happening around some of those behaviours, and are there any differences happening at home or in the early childhood setting. All we may need to do is to really be a listening ear for that parent, hear what their worries are, maybe think about what's happening for that child in that setting, and then even observing the child a little more closely for a while, and then following up with that parent. We may need to get back to that parent, say, look, yes, I think there is an issue happening both in the early childhood setting and something that you've noticed at home. And let's think about that together. Maybe what kind of approach could we take together, and what steps do we need to do together? And as Lynn pointed out, that might be talking to a health or community professional like a GP. It might mean going through primary health network referrals. It may be talking to another mental health professional, a psychologist, or someone else that we know. But there's ways and strategies, I guess, that we can gain that trust. One thing I'd like to just highlight is, I guess, just the necessity of that kind of shared care, and perhaps where children do have already established diagnoses, or where they're entering a centre or perhaps coming into a centre and we've already recognised that there's some difficulties, is just how important it is to have that shared approach and that shared care plan. So we really need to be able, I guess, as adults, to have some consistency around the way that we're approaching how we intervene with that child, and to agree that we're all going to do that together. So having that in a written format and being able to talk to parents about that, I think, is really important. And if that changes over time, or where we might get some recommendations or input from health professionals around changes, for that communication process to be happening on a regular basis as well. So that's something we might ask, with the children that we're working with. Are there care plans in place, and do we know about them? We talked a bit about self-awareness and being in tune with our own feelings and triggers that might activate, some of those strong feelings in ourselves, and what might assist us to prepare and deregulate in some of those challenging situations. So we're going to have a look in a little while about the Stop, Reflect, Act model, and just show a short snippet of that. And one of the questions you might ask yourself, when you're watching that video, is how would I be feeling, and what kind of awareness, would I have at that point around my own emotions and feelings, and how might I manage that? Because often we forget about that. We're too busy tuning in perhaps to the parent that we're talking with, or perhaps trying to manage a child at, any particular situation, and we forget about the need to be self-aware ourselves. Lynn touched on some of the professional boundaries, and I think as educators, we already do a lot of work in this area, but, again, it's important to have conversations as a team, I think, around what are those boundaries, and at what point do we actually, talk to a parent, and do we seek help? At what point, what kinds of things might activate that. We've already talked about things like policies that might help us prepare in that situation. And following through with parents and maintaining confidentiality and privacy is really important too, I think. So if we do have a meeting and we take the time maybe to talk about and problem solve how we're going to approach a situation, we then need to maybe make a time to follow up and get back to that parent, particularly if we said that we'll, provide some information to them, or we'll check out something. Really important to make sure that we do follow through, and that we're aware of any kind of limitations around confidentiality and privacy. And that might be, how we talk to our team members, where we are when we have some of those difficult conversations. Are we in an office, or are we in a public area, and just being really supportive with those kinds of environmental things as well. Okay, so I think we might stop there and have a look at the Stop, Reflect, Act video. I'm going to show you a couple of minutes of this video. This is in our professional learning, and we'll put the link up into the chat so that if people want to access that, they can have a look around that. So this is the Stop, Reflect, Act model. It's a framework really for assisting parents with some of those conversations and supporting and hearing parents. So let's have a look at that now. So the Stop, Reflect, Act model, that was just a quick taster. If people would like to know a little bit more about that model, go and have a look at the professional learning videos. I'd really recommend taking some time maybe just to work through those. And that was a quick example of how that Stop, Reflect, Act model might be in action. It's also there's an example in our workbooks. So some of the Kids Matter workbooks in the professional learning section have been rewritten, and some of the content is quite new there. So having a look at the link around the participant workbook and how you might use that maybe as part of your staff meeting discussions, and how to explore how useful that is in your setting, that would be great to go and have a look at that workbook just to get some ideas for how you could share, practice in that area as well, and other kind of communication strategies. All right, so I don't think we've got much time, Sarah, maybe to do an active discussion around the model, but if anyone would like to share any of their perhaps practice around using models like Stop, Reflect, Act, or perhaps other similar ways that you've worked with parents, please feel free to share that in the chat, or to maybe write some comments after the webinar to have a look at some of those examples as well. We always love hearing your stories about what's working in this area. And I'll hand back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Kerry. Yes, if you've got anything you'd like to share in the chat around, as Kerry said, about your ways that you may have used Stop, Reflect, Act already, that would be great. The other thing that as Kerry said, we're coming towards the end of the webinar too. And so we've had a little bit of conversation in the chat, and Kerry and Lynn have given you some ideas to think about what actually help seeking looks like and what the barriers are. And then we've really explored in the last half of the webinar about the ways that you can create environments that enable help seeking and invite help seeking, and then ways to respond when help seeking occurs, when you notice the help seeking occurring. And what we'd really like you to share now as well, so either in the chat, or you can, if you click on through here, you can share your thoughts on our blog post about what you're thinking that you might do, or what you're thinking might be your next step in terms of what you're going to do when you go back and start having conversations with your colleagues around how to support and perhaps even understand help seeking a little bit more. So you can click through to our blog post if you'd like and leave a comment there, or you can leave a comment in the chat. That would be great. But remember to come back. So if you click on where it says share your first thoughts now, that's the link that will open up a new tab, and you can make some comments in the chat. But don't forget to come back, because we've got a couple more things to go as we just finish up. Looks like people have gone a bit quiet. Then maybe their heads are a bit full and they're not quite sure what to do yet. Maybe while we're waiting too, Melinda was asking before, Kerry and Lynn, whether we supply free resources to libraries. And I know, I think it was Rita responded in the chat, but I guess I just wanted to let people know that as we've been sharing the Kids Matter resources, all of the resources are available on the website, so you can share these with your networks. And like we've been talking about, it was great to hear from Rebecca about, as a mental health professional, about her perspective about what's useful for her and how to connect. So I think making those connections, having those connections beyond your services, is a really important part of this process. So if you've finished sharing your ideas, and a couple of people are putting their ideas in the chat, so it's great to hear what you might be doing. And remember, the very next thing you might want to do is start thinking about how you're going to connect in with Kids Matter. So if you are a Kids Matter service or a participating Kids Matter service, remember I said at the beginning that this topic connects with, this conversation connects with the topic of communication and also responding to children who are experiencing mental health difficulties. And so when you next check in with the Kids Matter team, with your consultant or in a learning and networking event, then you can have those conversations about what actions you're going to put in place or what learning you might want to do. If you're not a Kids Matter service and you'd like to become a bit more connected to Kids Matter and start thinking about how you can implement some of these ideas in a little bit more of a planned way, then you can connect with Kids Matter and become a participating Kids Matter service. We'll pop a link in the chat about how you could do that in a second. So just to finish up, it'd be great to get Lynn and Kerry back just to hear their final thoughts as a wrap up.
I'll start. I think Kerry's still with us, but her camera's not working, Sarah. So
okay.
I'll kick off, and then Kerry's listening. I guess just quickly, because I know time's going, one of the things that we didn't talk about, but I saw in the chat, was about parents connecting with each other as a way of getting support. So we're sort of talking about parents going off and getting help, and one of the great sources of support for parents, of course, is other parents who've been through that or going through the same thing. So fabulous support, really important. Of course, your role can be connecting people broadly and generally. So again, all that work you're doing earlier on in your Kids Matter journey, not just waiting until there are difficulties, means that parents can kind of find each other and know each other. So I think that's a really, really useful idea that we hadn't talked about.
Thanks, Lynn. And Kerry, are you there?
Yeah, we've just had an internet disruption, but I think one of the key messages, just to finish off, Sarah, would be check out some of the Kids Matter tools to assist with supporting conversations with families, like the e-learning package and the topics in component 3 and 4 areas of the professional learning, and really take the time to, share experiences around this area, around what really assists with some of those conversations, because I think as educators, that's where we can make the key difference in terms of breaking down those barriers.
Yeah, thanks. And I was thinking, it's really important to connect with families, but also remember that children will ask for help as well, and to not forget that that's an important and integral part of this whole process. I guess it connects back with what I said right at the beginning about really listening to what's happening and tuning in and cueing in and creating a safe environment, not just a physically safe but an emotionally safe environment, so people feel like they can put their toe in the water and then participate more, because that's the thing that's going to make a difference. It's a really important protective factor for the mental health of everybody. So it's great to hear some of the things that people are planning on doing next, and now we've got some more questions coming and we'll run out of time. So I'd just like to remind you that you can continue learning together. One of the things we really value in Kids Matter is that learning together is really critical. So, keep sharing your thoughts about after the webinar, or join Kids Matter and participate in the learning community that we have, that's full of people who are really passionate about mental health and wanting to grow children's healthy minds, but also support each other as well. So thank you, everyone. Don't forget there's a survey at the end, and if you'd like a certificate, you need to fill in the survey, and remember to keep connected with us, and thanks for coming.